So for our next speaker, we have Jennifer Brown, and her word is power. Jen is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting. It's a inclusion and diversity firm in New York City, and they basically have the hairy job of going into Fortune 500 companies and telling them to accept people. It can get hairy. So please help me welcome Jennifer Brown.
I'm in a room with 25 white male executives, and they're scowling at me. I know that they've stepped away from making their oodles of money to attend a required training on a topic that makes most people really uncomfortable. The room is silent, and they're watching the clock. I am there that day to talk about why diversity and inclusion matters to their company. They've been in the headlines recently about a harassment lawsuit involving homophobic and sexist comments on the trading floor. The CEO, a man with daughters, is having none of this, not on his watch. So they've brought my company in to do focus groups for hundreds of employees to try to understand what in the culture led to this kind of behavior being acceptable. I'm in the room that day and I'm armed with the feedback, and it's not pretty. So I do this for a living. I specialize in the topic. I've presented across the Fortune 500, and I'm really not in any danger that day, but I'm not feeling safe. Far from it. I'm actually on high alert. I've scanned the room and I've noticed I'm the only woman in the room. They probably have not noticed that. And I'm pretty sure, although we're never entirely sure, that I am the only member of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community in the room that day. I'm quite sure that has not crossed anyone's mind. As I'm doing this calculus, I'm asking myself, as I often do, how safe and how brave am I feeling today? So as I start the facilitation, I'm walking a fine line of integrity because I can relate to this feedback so deeply. It was my story too when I was in corporate America, but I've got to stay detached and objective, lest they accuse me of bias because of my gender. Some of the louder voices in the room are dominating the discussion, arguing with the data and minimizing the feedback. Robust discussion is a part of every C-suite discussion, but comments that I'm hearing are like, I really don't want to know about people's personal challenges, or everyone has equal opportunity here, or I don't care if you're red, green, or yellow, I'm just going to hire the right person and the best person for the job. And my personal favorite, Jennifer, are you saying we have to have quotas? I see myself in the feedback, and they do not see me. That moment, I decide not to come out. That day, I did something called covering. So covering is defined as minimizing a stigmatized identity, downplaying a known stigmatized identity. Deloitte and Kenji Yoshino researched covering in the workplace, and they come up with the 4 A's, which is an easy way to think about covering. How are the ways that we cover? So appearance-based covering might be when an African-American woman doesn't feel that she can wear her natural hair in the workplace. Affiliation-based covering might be when a dad doesn't take advantage of parental leave even though it's offered, because those who take advantage of leave are viewed as less committed to the job. Advocacy-based covering is when a gay man refrains from challenging a homophobic comment lest he be viewed as overly strident because he's advocating for his community. And finally, association-based covering. This might be when a millennial woman tries to distance herself from the word feminist. So those of us in historically underrepresented groups, so women, people of color, lesbians and gays, people with disabilities, report feeling the need to cover on a much greater basis, and these numbers are certainly dispiriting. We cover, in addition to identity-based ways, we cover around other aspects of who we are, like if you have 2 moms, or maybe you're Americanizing your first name, or you're covering around your faith, or you're minimizing your accent. There's some other people, though, that were report covering in the report, and might surprise you. So our friends, the white straight guys, 45% of them report covering as well, along a lot of the same stigmatized identities that other communities report. Now, how is it a little different? Maybe you've got a feminist in the room. I've met them, I know they're there. Maybe you've got a Democrat. I've had them come out to me as Democrat in a conservative company. Maybe they grew up poor. Maybe their wife makes more than they do. So we thought it was hysterical. Remember this movie, Meet the Parents? You know, Ben Stiller, who's playing Gaylord, or Greg Fokker, right, the male nurse, he is trying to stigmatize, to hide and downplay those stigmatized identities from his father-in-law. So that movie really makes you feel the squirm, right? But this is really real for men, all jokes aside. I was facilitating another executive group, all men again, and I asked them for their diversity stories. One of the men volunteered that when he was new at the company, they had scheduled an all-hands meeting halfway across the world over his high holidays. He was Jewish. So after some soul-searching conversations, very difficult conversations with his wife, they decided, A, he would go, and B, he wouldn't say anything. In the room that day as I was facilitating, he was telling us this story for the first time. And I think he was also talking about his faith for the first time in front of his team. This is the deadly 1-2 punch of covering, an organization that's completely unaware of its biases and an individual who, sensing that, covers their truth. And that's the moment when trust is broken. So every time we adjust our truth, it becomes a matter of integrity. That day when I didn't share something as important to me as who I love in my family, it felt bad and unfair, and it was tinged with shame. We come up with a million excuses. It would have been relevant to the conversation, or it might have distracted them, and I couldn't risk losing my audience, or I'm having a bad hair day. Whatever we come up with not to do the right thing, right? But feeling the impulse to cover on a regular basis is far from harmless. I call it death by 1,000 cuts. We're spending energy navigating this dilemma between safety and authenticity, and that energy could be spent building our professional and personal successes. Everybody that reported covering in that report said it was moderately to very detrimental to their sense of self. So I think of it like an iceberg. The energy it takes to suppress our truth is, like my friend Vivian Ming refers to it, like paying an extra tax on being different. So who's different? Well, I see org charts like this constantly in corporate America in my consulting work. We call that poor woman in the corner the only and lonely. It might be a woman, it might be a person of color, but this is a very common sight as you look up the pipeline in your organization. Very dispiriting. When Silicon Valley looked at their diversity numbers, they decided to go full transparency in 2014. And as predicted, the numbers were very disappointing. For women, they are represented in the teens at companies like Apple, Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Even worse for minority talent. So Hispanic folks and African American folks are represented in the single digits. So for recruits that are evaluating these companies, it's so unappetizing. Why would I want to go someplace where I don't see anyone on a daily basis that looks like me? And for current employees, it's really disheartening. So we have though been really creative with our workaround. So I don't know if anyone remembers this movie, The Associate, Whoopi Goldberg. She actually is an investment professional in this movie and invents a white male business partner in order to legitimize her business. It's awesome. And more recently, TV reality star and mogul Bethany Frankel was speaking to a room full of successful women entrepreneurs, and when the question came up about how difficult it is to raise VC funding, she said, maybe you want to grab a white guy and take him with you to investor meetings to help you close the deal. So these stories are separated by several decades, but they're sadly evergreen, and they show the lengths to which talented people feel they need to go to get a fair shot. Bethany Frankel, there was, of course, a firestorm on Twitter about her remarks and a lot of soul-searching for women on both sides of the issue about what they thought about what she said. Was it right? Was it wrong? But I think what's more interesting and intriguing to me and relevant to the days we live in is the role of privilege in both of those stories. So I'm often asked, what in the world are you doing as a diversity consultant? I'm a white woman from an affluent background. The advantages of my socioeconomic background and my ethnicity were not earned by me, but I have come to recognize them as powerful tools for change. I can get into rooms and have conversations that other people can't. I will be listened to in a different way. I will not be called strident or a troublemaker behind my back. So far from surrendering to inequality, which I will never do, I am choosing to utilize my voice on behalf of others, and I believe that it's the least we can do. On the flip side, Others are using their relatively more privileged identities on my behalf. So men are standing up in the media and in corporate America. Patrick Stewart is one of my favorites as gender allies and allies for inclusion. Straight allies in corporate America are flooding the gates and outnumbering LGBT colleagues and having conversations on our behalf that we are so too fatigued to have, or that it's too risky for us to have. They are leveraging their privilege on my behalf. So our combination of privileged and non-privileged identities is something that I call intersectionality. And if we can find the joining of these pieces of who we are, we become exponentially powerful leaders. So I'd like to ask you to think about a privileged aspect of your identity and a non or lesser privileged aspect of your identity. What roles have those played in creating who you are as a person, as a leader? Perhaps you hold master's degrees, but you're first generation in your family. Maybe you're an entrepreneur of color. Maybe you're a stay-at-home dad, or you're a primary caregiver who's a man. As our world diversifies so quickly, all of these parts of you are your teachers. So, how can we reduce covering, feeling the need to cover for individuals, for companies? First of all, own your diversity story, step into the light with it. Even if you don't think it's a big deal, I can guarantee you it's a big deal to others who need to borrow your bravery. Secondly, inclusion includes everyone, and yes, this even means the white guys and the people with apparent privilege. When I was in the room that day, I missed out by not sharing my story on what people could have given me and what I could have given them. Even in a room that looks like this, when I wrap up my session, somebody will sneak by me and say, "Thank you," quietly to me. That's how I know that I have to keep going with this work. Number 3, take heart. The landscape is changing. Corporate America is standing up like never before for equality. Target is welcoming transgender guests to use the facility that corresponds with their gender. Salesforce.com is grossing up pay for women and has spent already $3 million and more to come. And companies are pulling out of North Carolina because of bills there that are legislating inequality. This is allyship on a big stage, and it's a big deal. And finally, leverage the millennials. They're going to be over 50% of the workplace by 2020. And one of their most cherished values is feeling seen and heard. So if that's entitlement, sign me up. So just because we don't believe that diversity and inclusion just happens in organizations, just like we thought that because we had a black president that we were in a post-racial society. Certainly not true. I'd like to ask all of you to level up. So think about yourself on an ally continuum, if it helps you to think about where you are and all of us are in our journey of allyship. If you're apathetic, you don't have any understanding of the issues I've talked about today, get aware, learn about them. Secondly, how can you become aware from apathetic? So you know your concepts. You may not be active on behalf of self or others yet, but at least you know the issues. Then, how can you activate yourself? You are well informed. You're sharing and seeking diversity. You may not be doing it proactively, so you wait to be asked or you wait to be prompted. How can we move from that to true advocacy, committed and routinely and proactively championing inclusion? So I'd like to ask all of you to think about where you are in that continuum. And if 50% of this room is covering right now, I don't want to live in that kind of world. And I hope that you'll join me in fixing it. Thank you so much.